There is a specific kind of exhaustion that nobody talks about. It is not the exhaustion that comes from working too hard or sleeping too little. It is the exhaustion that lives in your chest, the kind that follows you into rooms you thought were safe, the kind that makes you question whether your own feelings are real. If you have ever walked on eggshells inside your own life, if you have ever felt completely responsible for the emotional weather of someone who never once took responsibility for theirs, then what I am about to say is not just for you. It is about you. You were never the problem. But before we get there, we need to talk about what happened first. There is a specific moment that every empath who has been in a relationship with a narcissist eventually reaches. It does not arrive with dramatic music or a clean epiphany. It arrives quietly, almost invisibly, the way the light changes just before sunrise when you are not entirely sure if the dark is finally ending or if your eyes have just adjusted. That moment is the moment of seeing. Not seeing the narcissist for what they are, although that is part of it. The deeper seeing is when you finally see yourself. When you look at the reflection they spent years distorting and you recognize, for the first time in a long time, that what stares back at you is not who they told you that you were. That recognition changes everything. But here's what the narcissist never expected. They never expected that the very sensitivity they exploited would one day become the most sophisticated psychological armor they had ever encountered. They targeted your empathy because they believed it made you easy to control. But what they failed to understand is that empathy is not weakness. Empathy is intelligence, deep, lived, emotionally precise intelligence. And when that intelligence finally turns inward, when it stops desperately trying to understand the narcissist and starts understanding itself, something shifts in the dynamic that the narcissist cannot reverse, cannot explain, and absolutely cannot tolerate. A narcissist is not simply someone who is arrogant or self-obsessed. The deeper psychological reality is this. A narcissist is a person whose identity, self-worth, and sense of reality is entirely dependent on external sources. They need constant validation, admiration, and emotional reactions from other people, because without those reactions, they feel internally empty in a way that is genuinely unbearable. This is why they are so extraordinarily skilled at obtaining emotional responses. Not because they are powerful, because they are desperate. Because underneath every act of cruelty, every manipulation, every calculated moment of coldness or rage is a profoundly fragile psychological structure that cannot survive without feeding from others. And they chose you because you were full of exactly what they needed. Empaths feel the emotional world with an intensity that most people cannot comprehend. You did not just notice other people's pain, you absorbed it. You did not just feel compassion, you felt responsibility. But when a narcissist enters the life of someone with this level of sensitivity, they do not see a beautiful quality, they see a resource. They see an unlimited supply of emotional energy they can draw from without ever giving anything genuine in return. The relationship begins with what feels like magic. This is intentional. The intense attention, the feeling of being truly seen, the sense that you have finally found someone who understands the depth of you. None of that was accidental. It was a calculated process called idealization. The narcissist mirrors your values back to you. You fell in love with the reflection of your own soul without realizing that is precisely what you were looking at. But the reflection was never real. Then the devaluation began. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. A comment that felt slightly off. A moment of coldness that confused you. And because you are an empath, because your first instinct is always to look inward, you turned the confusion on yourself. Maybe I said something wrong. Maybe I am too sensitive. Maybe I am not enough. This is where the narcissist's real work begins, not in the cruelty itself, but in engineering the conditions in which you doubt your own perception of the cruelty. The fact that it worked on you does not mean you were weak or naive or broken. It means you were someone who chose to believe the best of the person you loved. It means you were functioning from a place of genuine love in a dynamic where genuine love was being weaponized against you. That is not weakness. That is one of the most painful things a human being can experience. Now, let us talk about the difference between an empath and a super empath, because this distinction matters enormously. A standard empath is someone who feels deeply, who is naturally attuned to others, who has a profound capacity for compassion. They may spend a long time in a narcissistic relationship, cycling through confusion and hope and self-blame before they eventually find their way out. A super empath is something different. Not better in a hierarchical sense, but different in a structural one. A super empath has all of the same depth, the same sensitivity, the same profound attunement to others. But they also carry within them a capacity the narcissist never anticipated. A super empath has a threshold, a point at which the giving and the absorbing and the healing and the hoping eventually converges with something harder and cleaner, something that lives underneath all that softness. A super empath has a core, and when that core is finally touched, when the manipulation finally reaches the deepest and most protected part of who they are, something does not break, something awakens. The narcissist pushed hard enough to find the wall, and the wall pushed back. What makes this psychologically fascinating is not the confrontation itself. Super empaths do not necessarily become loud or aggressive. What happens is something far more unsettling to a narcissist. The super empath goes quiet. Not the silence of defeat, the silence of clarity. The silence of someone who has finally, fully seen what is in front of them and has made an internal decision so complete and so grounded that it does not require announcement. And the narcissist noticed it immediately. They noticed it because they are exquisitely attuned to shifts in the emotional supply they receive. They notice when the energy changes. They notice when the anxious over-explaining stops. They notice when you stop flinching. And what they feel in response is not relief, not respect. What they feel is alarm. Because your emotional reactions, even the painful ones, even the crying and the pleading and the confusion, were still proof that they had power over your internal state. When the reaction stopped, the foundation cracked. The narcissist was never primarily after your love. What they were after was your reactivity. Your love was the door. Your reactivity was the oxygen they needed to survive inside that space. Every time you tried to explain your feelings, every time you apologized for things that were not your fault, every time you tried harder to be enough, you were feeding a cycle that was never designed to satisfy either of you. And here is the moment that changed the entire equation. When the super empath stopped reacting, not out of coldness, but out of genuine understanding, the narcissist was suddenly operating in a vacuum. They escalated. When a narcissist senses their emotional control slipping, they intensify their tactics. They may return to fragments of the idealization phase, offering sudden tenderness, telling you they have changed, that this time it will be different. This is called hoovering. Its sole purpose is to suck you back in. But that was the moment their control started collapsing. Because the super empath, having reached the place of internal clarity, looked at the sudden tenderness and felt something new. Not hope, not the old desperate warmth. What they felt instead was recognition. They recognized the pattern. They recognized the timing. The tenderness was not appearing because the narcissist had grown. It was appearing because the narcissist was afraid. And when you can feel the difference between love that seeks your well-being and manipulation that seeks your reaction, the charm loses its power entirely. And the silence became louder than any argument ever could. The confusion an empath experiences inside a narcissistic relationship is not ordinary confusion. It is a specific psychological state that results from being repeatedly exposed to contradictory realities. The narcissist tells you one thing and does another. They create a problem and then punish you for reacting to the problem. This keeps your nervous system in a state of chronic low-grade vigilance, always scanning, always trying to predict the next shift in their mood, always trying to manage the temperature of an environment you were never actually in control of. Over time, this creates cognitive dissonance. You hold two competing realities simultaneously: the person you love and the person who repeatedly causes you pain. And because loving them requires you to continuously reconcile these two realities, your brain works overtime constructing explanations that protect the relationship. Each explanation, which comes from a place of genuine care, also functions as a small surrender of your own perception. Layer by layer, you drift further from your own ground. But something was already changing beneath the surface. Even in the deepest moments of confusion, even when the self-doubt was loudest and the fog was thickest, something inside you was quietly observing. Something was collecting data. Something was noting the patterns even when your conscious mind was busy making excuses. The body keeps a record. The nervous system remembers. And at a certain point, when enough evidence has accumulated, the mind begins to surface what it has known for a long time. This is the awakening process, and it is rarely comfortable. The awakening does not feel like relief initially. It often feels like grief, because when the fog finally lifts, when you start to see the relationship clearly, what you are also seeing is how long you have been in pain, how many times you blamed yourself for their behavior, how many nights you lay awake trying to solve a problem that was never yours to solve. The grief of that recognition is real, and it is necessary. You are not grieving the narcissist. You are grieving the version of the relationship you believed in, the version they created specifically to make you believe. Let the grief move through you. And then let it show you something on the other side. Because the moment you see your love not as naivety, but as integrity, the entire psychological framework shifts. You stop being the person who was fooled. You become the person who loved honestly in a dishonest dynamic. That is a profoundly different identity to inhabit. And from that place, something begins to rebuild inside you that the narcissist can neither access nor destroy. That is when everything changed. When a narcissist begins to lose emotional control over someone, they cycle through a very specific sequence of behaviors. First comes escalating charm. If that does not work, they may become suddenly vulnerable, confessing pain or fear or childhood wounds in ways they never have before. This is perhaps the most sophisticated and dangerous tactic in the narcissist's arsenal because it speaks directly to the empath's deepest motivation. Being shown someone's wound is almost impossible for an empath to walk away from. It activates everything in you that wants to help, wants to heal, wants to be the person whose love finally makes a difference. Do not let this break you. Let it inform you. Because the wound may be real, but the wound is not the same as accountability. The wound is not the same as change. And crucially, the timing of the revelation matters enormously. If the vulnerability appears precisely when their control is slipping, it is being deployed strategically. A person who is truly seeking healing presents their wounds in therapy, in recovery, in the slow and uncomfortable work of changing behavior over time. They do not present their wounds as leverage. When the super empath understands this distinction, something settles even deeper in their core. Compassion does not disappear. The super empath does not become cold or indifferent. What changes is something far more specific and far more powerful. The compassion becomes boundaried. It observes without absorbing. It can hold space for the reality of the narcissist's pain without volunteering itself as the solution for that pain. And this is what completely dismantles the narcissist's operating system. This is why calm detachment is more powerful than anger. Anger, while completely valid and often a necessary part of healing, still gives the narcissist something. It still confirms they have the power to affect your internal state. The one thing a narcissist genuinely cannot metabolize, the one response they have no counter strategy for, is your calm, grounded, emotionally present detachment. The kind that is not performed. The kind that comes from having genuinely processed the experience and arrived at a place of deep personal clarity. This kind of calm is not indifference. It is the presence of so much processed truth and integrated experience that the narcissist's provocations simply no longer penetrate. And that stillness, that unshakable inhabitation of your own ground, is the most psychologically unnerving thing a narcissist can encounter. They do not know what to do with a person they cannot move. When you begin to heal from narcissistic abuse in a real and sustained way, not just managing the symptoms, but genuinely integrating the experience, the shift that happens is not just psychological. It changes the way you occupy space. It changes what you are willing to accept. Things that you used to tolerate, not because you wanted to, but because you had been so gradually normalized to them that you could no longer identify them as violations, those things begin to feel wrong again. Your nervous system recalibrates. Your capacity to detect contempt, to recognize manipulation, to identify the early signs of boundary erosion, all of that becomes sharper and more immediate. And clarity is power. Real, non-aggressive, deeply rooted power. The reason you were in this relationship, the reason you stayed as long as you did, the reason you tried as hard as you did, is not evidence of damage. It is evidence of depth. It is evidence of a capacity for commitment and care and emotional investment that is genuinely rare. The narcissist did not choose you because you were easy. They chose you because you were extraordinary, because you were full of something they could not generate within themselves and could not live without. They were drawn to your light, and in their need and their dysfunction, they tried to contain it. But you cannot contain light. You can only try to cut it off from its source. And the source was never something they could touch. That source is still there. It was there through every moment of confusion, every night of self-doubt, every morning you woke up and could not quite remember who you were before all of this began. It was there in every act of kindness you extended when you were barely holding yourself together. The narcissist thought they were breaking you. They were, without knowing it, forging you. You are someone who loved with everything and survived the cost of that. You are someone who was taken apart and came back. Not as the person you were before, because that person did not know what you now know, but as someone cleaner and more defined and more genuinely themselves than you were when this all began. Now, every time you maintain a boundary without guilt, every time you observe a manipulation attempt from behind the calm glass of your own clarity, every time you choose your own peace over someone else's need to destabilize you, you are not just healing. You are becoming something the narcissist never had the psychological architecture to imagine. You are becoming fully, consciously, unshakably yourself. If this has moved you, if any part of this has made you feel seen in a way you have been waiting to feel seen, leave a comment below right now. Not just for the algorithm, but because somewhere in this community there is another person still in the fog, still questioning whether their experience was real, still telling themselves maybe it was their fault. Your words, your story, your simple act of saying, "I have been here too," might be the thing that finally reaches them. Subscribe to this channel if you want to continue this journey, because what we are building here is not just content. It is a space where the people who feel the most deeply are finally given the language to understand what happened to them and the mirror to see how strong they actually are. You have been searching for someone to finally understand what you went through. But the deeper truth, the one that will keep becoming more real the further you walk into your healing, is that the person who understands it most completely, the person who holds all the evidence, all the memory, all the felt sense of what it cost and what it truly meant, that person has been living inside you all along, and they are only just beginning to speak.